So the definition of foraging is those people who are subsisting primarily, maybe all, on wild resources. I much prefer the term hunters and gatherers or hunting and gathering to the term foraging. Although your associations with foraging are not terrible, in my mind, it implies some sort of grazing cow who is passively kind of going along, munching their way through the environment. And I don't like associating people with passivity like that, or even the cow, the poor cow. Cows are smarter than that. So I prefer the term hunting and gathering. It's a little more cumbersome, but it more accurately describes the societies and the people that we're talking about. The purpose of my class today is to convince you, if you're not already convinced, that foraging or hunting and gathering is a very smart and ingenious cultural adaptation. And I've underlined the word culture because it involves the use of sophisticated tools and sophisticated tracking of changes in the environment. It's something that humans developed, continues to develop and perfect. It is every bit as cultural as any other adaptation that we have, in the sense that it relies on tools and learning and passing that learning on from generation to generation. It also changes over time and over the years. It is the pattern which enabled people to spread out almost everywhere in the planet. In fact, almost all the areas of the world, places that do not look habitable, like the Arctic or various deserts. The tropics perhaps look more habitable just because that's where people evolved first. But there are different tropical systems of hunting and gathering. There's different ways of doing this, but it's the human adaptability, it's our cultural adaptability, our use of tools and learning, which enabled people to go into places where you wouldn't think there could even be people, and to survive and thrive in these areas and change them. So it has actually been a very successful strategy, and it's also a quite sustainable strategy. So yeah, we'll get to that in a little bit, but it interferes the least with the resilience of the ecosystem, right? So it's also the system that humans and our ancestors and our cousins have used for 99% of our time on the planet, if we all want to throw ourselves into that group. Or even if humans as Homo sapiens, it would probably be 90% at least of Homo sapien time that people did not cultivate plants and animals. We lived with them. So I believe that we can also learn from hunting and gathering, even if we are at, yes, that's where it comes in, what is called the opposite extreme. Extreme modification with fertilizers and chemical pesticides, cutting things down. Yeah, we're sort of at the opposite extreme. So we can learn from them. Now, there's a kind of a general interesting principle of hunting and gathering, which I think one of you had a question about what this meant. The general principle, not in all the groups, but in many of the groups, is that you optimize effort rather than simply maximizing returns. So in our extreme of what we might call industrial agriculture, you're trying to maximize your returns. You're trying to get as much as possible out of that plot of land or out of that whatever it is you're doing, you're trying to get the most return for your effort. Whereas in many gathering and hunting societies, what you're trying to optimize is your effort. So you're trying to get the return that you need without expending too many kilocalories, both of your own muscles and of things like chemicals or industrial transport or those kinds of things. You're trying to optimize your effort. So it is actually, people have said that hunting and gathering is inefficient in the sense that you are not maximizing the return from a plot of land or whatever it is you're growing there. So in that sense, yes, it's not supporting a large population. It does not have the efficiency measures of industrial agriculture. However, that's one way to measure efficiency. Measured as optimizing effort, it's an extremely efficient and sustainable method of living. So yes, in some ways, if you maximize returns, you are then being more efficient, but you're having to have all of these kinds of inputs in terms of the chemicals and the transport and those kinds of things to get food out of the land. We'll be discussing industrialized agriculture in another chapter, but I just want to draw up this contrast because, again, oftentimes in our elementary school textbooks, they say, well, you know, the Native Americans only supported 2 people per acre or something, you know, these kinds of ideas about efficiency. And they're just different calculations on what it means to optimize and what it means to be efficient. Now, there are several stereotypes that I want to get away from, or I'll have various not, because I guess I would say that hunting and gathering, it's not just a system of food procurement. I mean, it is, but it also occupies this huge conceptual space in our heads, in the sense of when Jim's like, okay, it was the cave dwellers or the caveman, it's this idea that that's what everybody was like before. And so our stereotypes about hunters and gatherers are not just about a way of life, they're also about this idea of what people were like in the past, of how humanity is today, of what we should and shouldn't be. So I'm going to talk about some of these stereotypes. One is a lot of people believe that hunting and gathering is just one thing. And so they'll have a whole diet, a hunter and gatherer diet or a Paleolithic diet. And they'll say, well, this is what we were all eating 15,000 years ago. And as we know, this is how humans spread all over the world. So the way that people hunt and gather in the Arctic, which is going to be marine mammals and hunting big game and not much plant life, is going to be hugely different than the way people hunt and gather in Australia or in the tropics or even in the Pacific Northwest. And so the diet is also going to be different. There's not just one way of hunting and gathering, there's a bunch of different ways. So by extension, it is not equivalent to this idea of wild man or caveman or some sort of baseline of human nature. So a lot of people wanted to believe that this was some sort of original pattern and that whatever hunters and gatherers were doing, we could look back and that's what they would be. That was sort of people stripped of all culture. And in fact, Pluto, we know that this is not people stripped of all culture, because what did they have? What did they invent? Well, you know, from at least 42,000 years ago, or maybe 70,000 years ago, or maybe even further. We wouldn't know this from the clothing itself, because clothing famously deteriorates. When you're wearing animal skins, they're probably not going to show up in the archaeological record. But apparently that's about the time that head lice and body lice diverged, evolutionarily speaking. So if you're wondering how that happened, There it is. They live in the clothing. So the point is here, we are not talking about, naked people running around. This is a long, long time ago, long before agriculture. Also, we have this idea that all they do is work. They don't have time for anything else. All work and no play, right? And so this was one of the big discoveries of Richard Lee on page 78. He's kind of one of the key persons to overturn many of these stereotypes about hunting and gathering. And so they spent a lot of time talking about his work in the Kalahari. Page 78, before Lee and his colleagues began their study of these people, the Dobu Huansi, it was widely assumed they waged a constant struggle for survival, battling hunger and poor nutrition from day to day. So we often assume that there's, if you're a hunter-gatherer, you don't have time to have fun. There's no leisure time. You're just battling for survival. Whereas he found that they were, one, gregarious. They're a very gregarious people. They spend about a third of their time visiting other camps. They're not just in one place, they're going from place to place, visiting other camps. They have this conviviality, talking to each other. Describe the constant babble of voices at night, when residents and visitors exchange notes on rainfall and water holes, ripening vegetables and fruits and animal tracks in what amounts to a debriefing. Also, they have to organize the all-night dances that they hold 2 or 3 times a week. How many all-night dances did you go to this week? No all-night dances? I've not been to an all-night dance in quite a while, and certainly not 2 or 3 times a week. My goodness, that's a lot of dancing. You wouldn't know it. What Lee calculated is that at least in this area, people could fulfill their subsistence needs on about 15 to 20 hours of work per week. Yeah, think about your credit hours you're taking and how much time you have to study and read and do my homework. Think about working a 40-hour job. And then think about being able to work 15 to 20 hours a week to fulfill all your subsistence needs and have plenty of time to tell stories, be gregarious, visit your buds, dance all night. 2 or 3 times a week. I don't know. That can't be right. That sounds like a little too much dancing. Maybe not everybody dances all night, but if somebody's dancing all night, it's hard not to do it with them, right? Anyway, the other thing is that people believed that the gathering and hunting groups were composed of close kin, that all these bands of people were just basically in marrying kinship groups. And in general, they, as you pointed out, they interpret kinship very broadly. And so that means that you would not only have kin in your own group, but there might be kin in other groups or people that have a name, that share your name. And so you can go from group to group and you can always find someone who you might say that you're related to and find this kind of hospitality. And so when they actually measure the amount of relatedness in most hunter and gatherer societies, they actually find that it's fairly low. The people tend to travel a lot and form different groups, different seasonal groups, and these groups rearrange themselves. So it's not like just your family. You can find family and friends in other places. And so, at least before people started putting up all these fences and borders and things, there used to be much more wide-ranging ability to go to different groups and join and rejoin different places. Sticking with the knots, they're not throwbacks or living fossils. So, actually, Liv, you had a great quote on this about how they live in the 21st century. Remember that? Why did you like this quote? They're 21st century people with 21st century problems. What does that mean?
Like, well, I was like, just because people live differently doesn't mean that like they're more inferior than us.
Yeah, so one, just because that's a good point. Just because people do different things doesn't mean they are ranked as superior or inferior. And just again, be very careful when you look at people who are hunting and gathering. People are like, that's what we did back then. And anyone in the present who is doing this is as modern as we are. They have changed over time. They have 21st century problems just like we do. So I agree, Amanda, that we're not going back in the sense that I'm not about to tell you that, well, we're all going to be eating mushrooms and wild berries from now on. And we should be careful of the idea that we are going back or going forward. But we should recognize that the people here are people we can learn from without necessarily saying that we're going to all do things the same way. The other thing I want to emphasize here is that, and in some ways, Richard Lee was the person who proved this while at the same time writing or editing a whole book called Man the Hunter. And so we have this idea of caveman or caveman the hunter, who was the person providing for this whole group or whole family. And what we found is that in most groups outside of perhaps the Arctic and the Northwest, is that gathering plants and tubers and all those things provides the most calories. And this is something that primarily women would do, but also men do this as well. And we probably should also recognize that they may not have been as fixated on the gender binary as we have been in modern societies, but that the gathering provides the most calories, and that hunting is not necessarily what we imagine as sort of a man stalking an animal. There are various ways to hunt, including animal drives, surrounds, net hunting. So this is something that many different people, including women and children, can participate in. It isn't necessarily limited to just the man. So one of the other things I want to emphasize is that although the gathering and hunting peoples are not cultivating, they're not planting, they're not domesticating the animals and plants they live on, they are active managers of their environment. And they do things in the environment to encourage the growth of plants and animals that they consider favorable to them. And they do something, or for making baskets. Actually, was anybody surprised by what they do to help the good plants and animals grow, to get the good basketry materials so you can weave baskets? How do you make baskets? Hard to make baskets out of old plants. What do you have to do? Burn. Yeah, you have to burn. This is a hugely important and kind of surprising thing. The use of fire. And this is in lots of different places. But particularly in the Americas, particularly in North America, the use of fire in different places and Australia too. So this would, the fire it's a, it's not willy-nilly. It's in certain places that you can encourage the growth of the animals that you would want. And especially it turns out for basketry, you need those requires material in the form of straight, supple growth taken from shrubs and trees unaffected by insects, disease, or accumulated dead growth. So you don't want those old ones. You need some new little ones so you can make those beautiful baskets. Interestingly, when I was growing up, Smokey the Bear told us that we should do everything we could to prevent forest fires, because if we had any forest fire, it would be terrible. And so we needed to put those out immediately and douse them. And this led to some terrible things, because if you don't regularly kind of trim the forest, you might say, through fire, then it results in the growth of undergrowth, which can then trigger even larger and larger fires. And so as they say here, modern forestry has belatedly just recently come to understand the value of these ancient techniques. So a lot of Europeans arrived in the Americas and they believed that they had landed in some sort of Garden of Eden that was tended by God alone. But in fact, the indigenous peoples, the Native Americans, had been actively managing the landscape with fire and other means. And when they tried to eliminate them or push them west or displace them, a lot of these landscapes ended up suffering. And the idea that all fires needed to be suppressed, especially in the West, has led to some pretty terrible wildfires that then were much more brutal than they would have been in the past. As a general rule, the exchanges among hunters and gatherers, both within and between groups, is one based on what we call reciprocity. And in terms of reciprocity, that is something where it's like there's not an accounting for it. So you give me something today, and I might have a little bit more tomorrow, so I'll give you some food. And this is called generalized reciprocity. Nobody's really keeping score here or adding up how much each person owes another. You might also call this sharing. Do we have any generalized reciprocity? Put it this way. How many of your parents are charging you rent? No, they usually don't. You're not supposed to charge your own children rent. You're not supposed to make them pay for their own food. If you have kids, that's on you. You're not supposed to make them pay for it. That's called generalized reciprocity. We don't keep track of these things. We just share, right? Now, eventually, once you get to be, say, 23, then I'm going to start charging you rent. But up until then, you get generalized reciprocity. Now, the other form of this is, or there's different forms of reciprocity. There's also what is called balanced reciprocity, which in this case tends to mean either a more formal or informal method of kind of keeping accounts or keeping score. So, this can happen in terms of gift giving. And in some ways, you may know around the holidays or maybe around graduations, and you'll be like, well, how much did they give us for when so-and-so graduated? And you'll want to kind of make it equal, right? You don't want to overdo it, but you don't want to underdo it either. Or if you're going to somebody's house, you might want to bring a bottle of wine or something that kind of balances things out, and then everybody has a party, and over time it all balances. In some societies, you might even keep very close track of things. in the Society of Michigan, where I once taught, there are these things called graduation house parties. When you graduate from high school, they'd come and they'd make a list of what people gave at the door, and then you'd have to give something of pretty much equal value when that person graduated. I don't think you all do these. You look confused, but graduation gifts in general are often kind of balanced around so everybody gets the same. Now, one of the things I want to note here is that for hunters and gatherers, for many, not all, reciprocity, or the give and take of life, or having this balance, is something that extends beyond just the human world. So we often think of reciprocity in economics as something that only applies to humans. But for hunters and gatherers, reciprocity is what you have with all living things, or the earth itself. And so, for example, in much of the Arctic or the Northwest, there's this idea that you shouldn't overhunt animals. And that there's this peculiar moment, actually among some of the hunting peoples, there's this peculiar moment when the caribou turns and looks at the hunter, and that is when you are allowed, because the animal has given itself up to the hunter. Now, this might sound a little funny, but in their worldview, the hunt is actually not a violent act. It's an act which is more akin to necessity of reproduction. So it's actually more like, too early in the morning for this, hunting is more like sex than it is like violence. So you would only take the animals that give themselves up. They briefly mention this on page 89, where they talk about the Inuit. Although many Inuit value the introduction of the rifles, some complain that has destroyed the mutual trust between humans and animals. And this idea that there's this relationship of trust, and that animals are a different kind of person that need to be respected. In many hunting and gathering societies, if they're gathering, the forest, the place where people are gathering, is considered to be the parent, and that you are in a situation in which your parents are providing for you in a world of generalized reciprocity. Now, I used to talk about this a lot in a different version of this class that got more philosophical. But in this society, these kinds of societies, they don't see themselves as hunting wild animals or wild plants or living in a wild forest. This is just their home. It's part of their domestic sphere. It's a world in which they are in relationships with these animals and plants. And as you can see, the reason I say in some version of this class, I get a little more philosophical about this, is our definition of hunting and gathering is that they are living on wild animals, but in their worldview, these animals are not wild. They're part of their domestic life. So, again, this is part of the reason why this system has been sustainable over time, is because it's based upon reciprocity and not taking too much from the natural environment. Now, in the world of today, most of the hunter-gatherers that we see are living in areas where no one else wants to be. And so people let them be there because the land is not good for agriculture. So in today's world, people who are still mostly hunter-gathering are mostly in places that don't support a whole lot of people, and they would be in, at best, small groups. they have to be very mobile. And in fact, Jim, what limits the population? Where do they have to go to get, say, water?
They have to wait till it rains or, I don't know, move until they find water.
Yeah, so you have to be mobile or you're dependent upon rainfall. And as they say, it's the amount of resources in the worst times that are going to be the limit on the population. You can't just average it out. So the populations that we see today are probably going to be pretty small, mobile, and they're generally taken to be pretty egalitarian. They don't have sort of formal laws and hierarchies. How do some people resolve their differences? What do they do? Singing, dueling songs, good way to get your troubles out. So there's different ways to adjust to group life. Now, again, people have speculated based on the hunting and gathering groups that they see in today's world and the documentation that we have, that maybe this is some kind of baseline pattern for human life, that we were always prone for being more informal and egalitarian and dueling songs and mobile and in small groups. However, very importantly, before there was agriculture, hunters and gatherers were everywhere. And they were in places that had a lot of resources. So it's only in today's world that we have pushed the hunters and gatherers out of the areas that they would have been. And so in the old days, before agriculture, there were certainly larger and more densely populated areas where they were hunter-gatherers. There were places where people had houses and they were settled for long periods of time. And rather than being informal, as they say, they had highly structured cultural systems. And so they would have had various forms of hierarchy. They may not have been as egalitarian as some of the groups are today. Now, many of these societies probably did a lot of fishing as well as hunting and gathering. And we don't talk so much about fishing because, in today's contemporary peoples, we don't necessarily see this pattern as much, but this would have been a hugely important thing. It certainly was the case in the northwest coast of North America, which they say is a hugely important example of people who were hunting, gathering, and fishing. And they had large settlements, complex ceremonial life, rich material possessions, all supported by the abundant fish, game, and wild vegetation of their territories. So what they say here is that they challenge all our easy stereotypes for non-agricultural populations. So this is a place that we were able to see this form of life. But like I said, this would have been true of lots of different places before agriculture. And so we're starting to realize, and this is why I got excited about my different little pictures, is that before agriculture, people were making art and crafts. They had buildings and architecture and even well decorated tombs. And this appears in a little box on page 64 called Göbekli Tepe, Architecture Before Agriculture, where they're dragging these 16-ton stone pillars up a hill in what is now Turkey. In the book, which I was able to teach last year for a different class, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, they sort of put a lot of these examples together because, in fact, this upends our usual ideas. Usually in archaeology classes and anthropology classes, we teach people that it's only with agriculture, it's only with domestication that you then have craft specialization, that you then have more concentrated settlements, that you then have grave goods and hierarchies and things like that. It turns out, as we're turning up more and more evidence, we have Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which was built a long time, even before Stonehenge. And as they say, it was pretty hard to build. We haven't even excavated all the stuff they were up there. There's also a place in North called Poverty Point. Anybody ever been there? Ever heard of it? Louisiana. Should go there. Place where people built huge mounds and gathered and did like crazy ceremonies and had a bunch of trade and stuff. Nobody's ever heard about it. It's actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's in our own country, but nobody ever goes there because we don't pay attention to it. It's pre-agriculture and has all kinds of things going on. Or more has been found out about the I think they're called the Jomon peoples in Japan before agriculture. They were building structures. Are these crazy rock circles that were put in areas of Finland and Sweden, different places, what are called giants churches, and the agricultural peoples that came in later were convinced were made by giant trolls and things like that. For those of you who've seen the movie Troll on Netflix, you might know what I'm talking about. This idea of, that there were giants in the land before, and these were obviously built actually by hunters and gatherers over time. Or this big wooden structure called the Shigir Idol, which is found. Again, an indication that a lot of the things that we attribute to agriculture, art, architecture, monumentality, was being done or could be done in hunting and gathering societies all over the world. Now, I want to switch up a little bit into the now. We've gone into the past and a little bit into how it might have been not too long ago. But at the end of the book, the end of the chapter, they give us different examples of what's happening to the people today. A couple of you had a question about why the Botswana government would put fences in and mess people's lives up. Simply in some ways because they live in areas where there are resources to extract, and we end up with 21st century people who have 21st century problems. I wanted to give us a few pictures of how you can go there from various tourist sites. Now, in your first paper for this class, I'm going to ask you to look at one of the groups, one of the people groups that we are talking about in these chapters. We're looking at a few of them today, but we'll be looking at more as we go along. So just keep your mind open. I'll ask you to sort of do a little tiny bit of research on what has happened to people. And one of the questions you might ask is, a lot of peoples today who are considered traditional, tourism is a part of their economy. And we might get down on tourism, and in some ways it can be more beneficial to the tourist companies and the people who are profiting from this, but sometimes it can be contribute to the local economy. So you can go to Botswana and see the people that they're called Bosserwa now. Or the Hadza, which are discussed on pages 83 to 85. Here you can go learn primitive living skills on this trip. Well, you could have gone, but it filled up for only $3,500, 2022. I don't know if I like the idea of primitive living skills, but you know, this is probably interesting thing to do. Or the Inuit. That one of the interesting conclusions is the Inuit are as dependent on industry and fossil fuels as the rest of the North America's population. So in order to get all these kilocalories, they need snowmobiles and be able to get things from far away. But you can also go up there. You can go to the Arctic and go tourisming in the Inuit culture. And some of this is probably done more respectfully than others. Or you can go see the, as I mentioned, the Gitsong are in in British Columbia in Canada, in the North American Northwest. And, you know, a lot of these people have had to go to court, to legal proceedings to try and get rights to their land, with sometimes success, sometimes not. But you know, again, this is a group which produced and produces incredible artworks, and other sort of stereotypical indigenous art like totem poles. And again, is a place where they have overturned or one place where they overturn the stereotypes of non-agricultural peoples.